Imagine living in a neighborhood where your only way in and out is controlled by someone else, and then one day that someone decides to punish you. Overnight, 5 massive speed bumps appear out of nowhere, so high they scrape the bottom of your car, so brutal they feel like roadblocks instead of safety measures. And if that wasn't enough, the president of that neighboring HOA went even further. She parked her own car in the middle of the road just to block construction trucks from fixing our streets. At first, it felt like petty control, but soon it turned into a battle for who really had the power. And trust me, she had no idea what was coming. I always thought my neighborhood was a peaceful place, the kind of community where people waved when you drove by and where kids could ride bikes without a worry. My HOA was not perfect, but it kept the streets clean and the houses looking nice. What I never realized was that our entire neighborhood depended on another HOA just to get in and out. Their roads were the only way to reach ours. At first, that never seemed like a big deal. We all assumed neighbors would treat each other with a little respect, but we were wrong. One morning, everything changed. I drove out as usual, heading to work when I felt a sudden jolt. My car slammed over something, and before I could process what happened, another bump hit me again. It was not just 1 or 2. The entire stretch of road had been turned into an obstacle course. 5 speed bumps lined the way. 3 of them were tall and narrow like mountains, waiting to scrape the bottom of every car. 2 of them were wide and laid diagonally across the road, so no matter how carefully you drove, you had to hit them at an angle. I slowed to a crawl but still felt my suspension strain. I could only imagine what would happen to older cars or to emergency vehicles trying to respond quickly. It was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. That day, neighbors started calling each other asking if anyone else had seen what had been done. Nobody in our community had been asked. Nobody had been warned. It was the neighboring HOA that decided to put them in place. At first, people thought maybe it was for safety. Maybe there had been complaints of speeding. But as more of us experienced the bumps, it became obvious they were not reasonable. They were designed not just to slow people down, but to punish anyone who used the road. The truth started to spread quickly. The neighboring HOA president had pushed for them and made sure they were installed without discussion with our board or our community. Now, to understand this woman, you need to know she had a history. She had always acted as if her community was superior to ours. She believed her roads were hers alone and that anyone driving through from our neighborhood was an intruder. For years she complained about traffic and delivery trucks. And now she had taken matters into her own hands. In the evenings, I watched neighbors creeping over the bumps in frustration. Some cursed under their breath. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Elderly residents worried about their cars being damaged. Parents with children in the back seat hated the jarring ride. But there was nothing anyone could do. The bumps were there, and they were not coming out easily. The frustration only grew when word got around about what she did next. Our HOA had scheduled road work. The streets inside our community desperately needed repaving. Construction trucks were set to come through. But on the morning they arrived, they found her car parked squarely in the middle of the access road, not on the side, not half blocking. She parked it like a barricade. The workers could not get in. She told them they were not allowed to drive heavy trucks over her HOA's roads because they would ruin the pavement. She had no problem with us suffering with broken streets. As long as her pavement was untouched, she was satisfied. Neighbors were stunned. I remember standing with a small group watching the trucks turn around. People were angry, but also confused. Could she even do that legally? Could she just block access like it was her private driveway? The idea that one person could hold 2 entire neighborhoods hostage was unbelievable. From that day on, I knew this was not going to be a small dispute. It was not about safety. It was not about protecting property. It was about power. She wanted to remind us that every single day we had to pass through her gates, that she could make our lives harder whenever she wanted. And unless we found a way to push back, she was going to keep tightening her grip. That realization settled heavy on me. I had joined my HOA because I believed in community. I wanted fairness and peace. I never thought I would find myself staring down someone who treated the roads like her personal weapon. But here we were, and I was beginning to realize that if we wanted any hope of fixing this, we had to fight back. The days after the speed bumps went in were some of the most frustrating I have ever seen in a neighborhood. Every single drive out of our community became a test of patience. It was impossible to leave without bracing yourself for the harsh jolt of the road. Some neighbors started taking photos of the underside of their cars to show the scratches and damage. Others complained about how their shocks were already wearing out faster than normal. It was not just an inconvenience. It was real money being drained from people who had done nothing wrong. One evening, a neighbor of mine named Carl knocked on my door. He looked tired and angry. He told me his wife was scared to drive her small sedan over the bumps because it made such a loud cracking sound underneath. She had started avoiding going out unless absolutely necessary. Another neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Green, said she was terrified her medical appointments would become harder to reach. She told me it was not just painful for her car, but painful for her body as well. The sudden jolts sent shockwaves through her back. The more people shared their stories, the more it became clear that this was no small decision. Those 5 bumps were affecting every single household in our HOA. They slowed emergency vehicles. They frustrated delivery drivers. Even school buses struggled to pass through smoothly. Yet when complaints were taken to the neighboring HOA president, she brushed them off. Her response was always the same. She claimed the bumps were necessary to slow traffic. She insisted her residents deserved quiet streets. It did not matter that nobody from our community had ever been caught speeding through. It did not matter that there had been no accidents to justify such extreme measures. Her answer was final. The bumps were staying. It might have been easier to accept if that was all she did. But her next move showed us she was not interested in compromise at all. She was interested in control. Our repaving project had been planned for months. Our streets were cracked, potholes were forming. We had saved money through HOA dues to fix them properly. The trucks were scheduled, the workers were ready. Yet, on the very first morning, there she was. Her car sat sideways across the road like a blockade. I remember the construction supervisor walking up to her window and asking politely if she could move. She rolled it down just enough to speak. Her voice was calm but sharp. She said the trucks would not be allowed to cross her pavement. She claimed heavy machinery would tear up her roads. She told him to turn around. The supervisor looked at me and the other residents standing nearby. His face showed the answer before he even spoke. There was no way through. The trucks turned back. The workers left. Our repaving project was dead before it could even start. We were left staring at a woman who smirked as if she had won some great battle. The anger that boiled in that moment was like nothing I had felt in a community before. People muttered under their breath. Some stormed back to their houses, slamming doors. Others whispered about calling the city. But deep down, we all felt trapped. It was a terrible feeling. Imagine knowing your entire neighborhood could not function without passing through another one. Imagine realizing that a single person held the power to make that passage unbearable. That was the position we were in. The neighboring HOA president had found the perfect way to remind us that her word mattered more than ours. The days that followed were filled with tension. Cars slowed to a crawl over the bumps. Residents cursed under their breath as they bounced and scraped. At community meetings, the frustration poured out. Some wanted to fight her directly. Others warned that fighting an HOA president could drag us into costly legal battles. People were divided. We were angry, but we were also unsure what could even be done, and she knew it. She walked her dog near the access road with the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. She waved at her own residents, who smiled back. Meanwhile, our people sat in their driveways talking about how unfair life had become. It felt like she had built an invisible wall between the two neighborhoods. One side had the power, the other side had no choice but to endure. I found myself lying awake at night thinking about the situation. It seemed unbelievable that in a country built on fairness and law, a single HOA president could effectively block an entire community from repairing its own streets. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. But anger alone was not going to fix anything. We needed a plan. We needed to find out if she really had the authority she claimed, because if she didn't, we were going to expose it. And that thought became the seed of something bigger. At our next HOA meeting, I stood up and asked a simple question. Does she even own the right to control that road? The room went quiet. People looked at each other. Nobody knew the answer. But I could see the spark in their eyes. For the first time, we were not just complaining, we were questioning. And questions can be dangerous for someone who holds power unjustly. Once the question was asked, it refused to go away. Did she really have the authority to block us, or was she bluffing behind the title of HOA president? The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that we were being bullied. But proving it was going to take effort. And before we could even get that far, people wanted to try simple approaches. Maybe, they said, if we talk to her respectfully, she will see reason. So that is what we tried. A small group of neighbors walked to her house one evening. I was there with Carl and Mrs. Green. We knocked and waited. She opened the door with a polite but forced smile. Carl explained how difficult the bumps were, making life. He told her about the scratches on his wife's car and the pain it caused Mrs. Green to travel over them. We asked if there was any way she would consider removing even one or two of them. Her answer was short. She said the bumps were necessary. She said her residents supported them. She reminded us that it was her HOA's property and her board's decision. Then she closed the door. That was it. No compromise, no compassion. Just dismissal. We walked back in silence. It was hard to describe the feeling. It was like being told you did not matter at all. The frustration started to boil over in our own community. At our next HOA meeting, the mood was heated. People interrupted each other. Voices rose. Some shouted about suing her immediately. Others warned that lawsuits would take years and drain money we did not have. Someone even suggested cutting through an empty lot to make a new access road. But that was not realistic. The lot was private property and no one was selling. Every idea seemed to collapse into more hopelessness. Meanwhile, the speed bumps stayed, the blocked road stayed, and she walked around like a queen. Weeks passed, and small attempts continued. One neighbor called the city to complain about road safety. Another filed a noise complaint, arguing that the bumps caused loud banging sounds every time a truck rolled over them. Nothing came of it. The city said it was private property and outside their jurisdiction. She knew exactly how to play the system. The more she ignored us, the bolder she became. She started parking her car near the access road, even when no construction was scheduled. Almost as if to send a message. You want to bring in trucks, not on my watch. Some days, she left it there for hours. Delivery vans were delayed. A moving truck once had to circle the block twice before finally squeezing through. She enjoyed showing us her power. The pressure in our neighborhood reached a breaking point when one night a resident's car actually broke down after hitting the narrowest of the bumps. The undercarriage was ripped open and fluids leaked onto the street. The tow truck had trouble even reaching him because of the same obstacles. That incident lit a fire under everyone. We called an emergency meeting. The room was full. People, who usually skipped meetings, showed up angry and ready to vent. Voices cracked with frustration. Some said we should blockade her road in return. Others said we should write letters to every resident in her HOA, telling them what kind of president they had elected. But as tempting as revenge sounded, we all knew acting rashly could backfire. That was the night I made a decision. If no simple complaint was going to work, then we had to fight smarter. We needed to look beyond the surface. Because laws exist for a reason, and no matter how much power she thought she had, there were limits. The problem was, none of us had the details. Did her HOA truly own those roads outright, or were they bound by easements and access agreements? The room grew quiet when I raised that point. People realized it might be the one path we had not explored. If the roads were bound by legal easements, then she could not just shut us out. If they were maintained with shared responsibility, then she might be overstepping. Carl leaned forward and said what everyone was thinking. We need answers, real answers, not guesses, not rumors. That was the moment the mood shifted. We went from helpless victims to investigators. We started assigning tasks. Some would look through county records. Others would check with city planning. I volunteered to dig through property maps and ownership files. Walking out of that meeting, I felt something new. For the first time since the bumps appeared, I felt hope. It was not certainty, but it was a path. And if that path led where I thought, it might, then the queen of the speed bumps was about to lose her crown. The search for answers started slowly, but it picked up speed once people realized how serious we were. I spent evenings on the county website digging through records that most people would never bother to look at. It was not easy. The documents were old, scanned badly, and full of legal language that made little sense at first. But after a few nights I found something interesting. The roads in question were listed as private, but they were also marked with a recorded easement. That meant other properties had a legal right to use them for access. Our HOA was one of those properties. It was written into the documents decades ago, when the neighborhoods were first built. In plain terms, she could not just deny us entry. She could not block construction trucks, and she certainly could not install obstacles designed to make access unreasonably difficult. When I showed the papers to Carl and the others, their eyes widened. It was like striking gold. For weeks we had felt powerless, but now the law itself was on our side. Mrs. Green actually teared up when she realized what it meant. We were not trapped, we had rights. We called another community meeting, and this time the mood was different. People listened closely as I explained what the easement meant. I told them it was not just about fairness or neighborly courtesy anymore. It was about legal obligation. If the other HOA wanted to keep those roads closed off, they would be breaking the law. And if they continued, the county and the courts would step in. For the first time, I saw real unity in our neighborhood. People who had been ready to give up were now energized. We decided to act carefully. The first step was a formal letter. Our HOA's lawyer drafted it and sent it directly to their board. The letter cited the easement, explained our legal right to road access, and demanded immediate removal of the excessive speed bumps. It also warned that if their president continued to block construction trucks, we would file suit. We all waited nervously for their response. Days passed with no word. Then one afternoon I saw her walking her dog near the access road. She avoided eye contact with me, which was unusual. Normally she enjoyed glaring at us. Later that week, our lawyer received a short reply. Their board acknowledged the easement. They still argued that speed bumps were necessary for safety, but they did not mention blocking construction again. That silence told us everything. She had been caught overstepping. Still, the fight was not over. The bumps remained, and they were the biggest problem. So we escalated. Our lawyer filed a complaint with the county, arguing that the design of the bumps was a hazard for emergency vehicles. We also submitted photos of the broken-down car and statements from residents about damage. The county sent out an inspector. When he drove over the bumps himself, his truck bottomed out. He shook. his head and wrote notes. That was the moment I knew we had turned the tide. Word spread quickly that the county was reviewing the situation. People in her own HOA began asking questions. Some of them drove over those same bumps every day and hated them just as much as we did. At one point, I overheard one of her neighbors muttering that she had gone too far. The shield of loyalty she had relied on was starting to crack. Weeks later, the county issued a notice. The bumps were not up to code. They had to be removed or modified. If not, fines would be imposed and legal action could follow. Our lawyer backed the notice with another letter, reminding their board that the easement made it even more serious. They could not hide behind the excuse of private property anymore. The morning the notice arrived, I saw her car parked outside her house. For the first time, it was not blocking anyone. It just sat there. She looked smaller somehow, like the confidence had drained away. She knew the fight was slipping out of her hands. That evening, our HOA gathered again. This time, there were smiles. We could feel victory coming, but more than that, we could feel respect returning to our community. We had refused to be bullied. We had stood together and found the truth hidden in dusty records. And soon, those bumps that had tormented us would be nothing but a bad memory. But before the removal crews came, something else happened that proved just how far she had fallen. Members of her own HOA started attending our meetings quietly. They wanted to hear our side. They wanted to understand why their president had dragged them into a conflict that could cost them thousands in fines. The walls she had built between our communities were crumbling, and she had done it to herself. For the first time in months, I felt calm driving home. The bumps were still there, but I knew their days were numbered. The battle was no longer about who had more power. It was about who had the law on their side. And that was us. The morning the removal crews finally arrived felt almost unreal. For months we had suffered over those bumps. For months we had been slowed down, scraped, delayed, and treated like second-class neighbors. But now, heavy equipment rolled up, not to repave our roads, but to tear out the obstacles that had caused so much frustration. I stood at the edge of the street with Carl and Mrs. Green as the first bump was hammered apart. The sound of cracking concrete echoed like justice itself. Neighbors gathered around with their phones, recording every moment. Some clapped as chunks of asphalt were lifted away. Others just smiled, relieved that the nightmare was finally ending. The president of the neighboring HOA was nowhere to be seen that morning. She did not come outside to watch. She did not wave her usual smug wave. Word was that she had stayed inside with her curtains drawn. Maybe she was embarrassed. Maybe she was angry. But one thing was clear. She had lost. By the end of the day, all 5 bumps were gone. The road looked smooth again. Driving out of our neighborhood felt like freedom. Cars no longer scraped. Delivery vans no longer slowed to a crawl. Even school buses rolled through without issue. It was as if a weight had been lifted off all of us. But the story did not end with the removal. The fallout for her was just beginning. The county fined their HOA for the unapproved and unsafe construction. Their own residents demanded answers about why they were dragged into a legal mess. And quietly, I heard that a group of them was already planning to challenge her position as president in the next election. It was poetic in a way. She had tried to use her power to control us. She had tried to treat the road as her weapon. But, in the end, her actions hurt her own community more than ours. And the law she thought would protect her ended up being the very thing that exposed her. For us, the victory was more than just smoother roads. It was proof that standing together mattered. In the beginning, many of us felt powerless. We thought we had no choice but to accept what she did. But the moment we asked the right question, the moment we looked for truth instead of just venting anger, everything changed. We discovered that bullies thrive on silence. The second you shine a light on them, their grip starts to slip. I will never forget the night after the bumps were removed. Our HOA held a small gathering in the community park. Families brought food. Kids rode their bikes in circles, laughing as they went over the newly freed road without bouncing into the air. Mrs. Green smiled wider than I had ever seen her smile. Carl raised a toast with a can of soda, saying, "To easements, to teamwork, and to never letting one person hold us hostage again." Everyone cheered, and as I looked around I realized something important. This was not just about roads. This was about dignity, about refusing to bow down to arrogance, about proving that even when someone seems untouchable, they are never bigger than the law or the truth. From that day on, driving out of our neighborhood always felt different. There was no tension in my chest, no anger boiling as my tires hit. Uneven pavement, just calm, just relief. Every time I rolled through that stretch of road, I remembered the battle we had fought and won. As for the neighboring HOA president, she faded into the background. Rumor had it she tried to defend herself at a meeting, blaming outsiders for exaggerating. But her residents were not fooled. They lived with the same bumps. They saw the fines on their budget. Her authority, once absolute, had been fractured. In the end, justice had a way of balancing things out. She built speed bumps to slow us down, but all she really did was speed up her own downfall. And maybe that is the biggest lesson. HOAs are supposed to protect communities, not trap them. Leaders are supposed to guide, not bully. And when someone crosses that line, the best revenge is not anger or retaliation. The best revenge is using knowledge, unity, and patience to turn their own power against them. So whenever I hear about a power-hungry HOA president now, I smile a little. Because I know what we accomplished. We proved that no matter how impossible the odds feel, a community that stands together can overcome even the worst roadblocks. Literally,